Landlong Conspiracy, a public affairs presentation.
Well, we've got Martha Mitchell on the brain today.
That made the news this week.
Made
Martha.
the news. The death penalty unconstitutional in the United States. That made the news. Sure.
That's great, yeah. Keep our political patsies alive till we can find out what really happened. I'm really glad. And other people, too, that are framed on death row. I'm collecting a list of people who... old fellows are coming forth now admitting they planted evidence on them, and I'd like to get them out alive. It's important to do away with the death penalty because so many people are paid money to say a person's guilty. And even if they are guilty, they should be understood and have a chance to explain the motivations for murder, how they went about doing a murder. I don't like the death penalty for about 30 reasons. But as a political researcher into political assassinations, when I know that men are sitting in the jail that didn't commit the crimes they're charged with, you do away with the death penalty, and then these men have a chance to tell, possibly, they won't all be killed in jail. Phil, you got a letter this week, a phone call from a group in Santa Cruz. Phil called me, wanted to know if I knew the name Don Amany, and I was not familiar with that name. He's the Northern California coordinator for an organization called the CIPA. It's the Committee to Investigate Political Assassinations, and they're having a party up in the Santa Cruz area this next week. And Phil asked me if I was familiar with this group. When you do political research, you meet all kinds of people. You meet people that come in to your research team that are legitimate researchers that are collecting information and sharing information. Then you meet other people that come from the Central Intelligence Agency that infiltrate your group just like any other group. You're in a sensitive area. And you have to be very careful to identify who is collecting information or collecting money or what the organization is. These particular people that have moved into the Santa Cruz area are under the leadership of a man named Rusty Rhodes, who was in Los Angeles for a couple of years, and he's moved up here and he's talking at the colleges and showing the 8mm movie of the killing of John Kennedy that Zapruder took, Abraham Zapruder, and he sells that movie, and he lets you know that President Kennedy's head went backwards. He shows you the movie that Dick Sprague had out of here, the same one, that his head goes backwards, and therefore the shots couldn't have come from where Oswald stood. But beyond that, I'm not sure how much research Rusty Rhodes has done. He's come from Texas when he moved to the L.A. area. I've never met him. I've talked to him on the phone a few times. A man that was on KGO with Rusty by the name of Paul Copley is in this committee, and I spoke to him on the telephone. They wanted to be on our show, Phil, and I asked Copley if he ever heard Dialogue Assassination, and he had only heard the one the week before he called us. These aren't very serious researchers if they live in the area and don't collect information or increase their knowledge of political assassination, the information that we throw out each week. They said that Penn Jones, the researcher in Texas, is national coordinator of their committee. I called Penn Jones this week, and he is not the coordinator of any committee to investigate assassinations. There is a national committee in Washington called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, headed by Bernard Fensterwald, from the Senate Crimes Investigating Committee. Fensterwald has a foundation that is recognized that all legitimate researchers are members of. And I think you have to be very careful and steer clear of these fringe groups. I don't know anything about Paul Copley, Rusty Rhodes, or Don Amany. When he called this station and you talked to him, he'd never heard one of our shows. Is that right? I mean, he said he had never heard Dialogue Assassination. And yet these
They'd heard bits and pieces of some shows.
Yeah.
But never heard the shows themselves.
Never really heard them. I don't know this organization. If you want to see the movies, go ahead. But the Committee to Investigate Political...
I think they're putting on a
fundraising
concerts.
To get money to go to the Miami convention. That's one of the things they wanted to do, is to get down there. You have to be very careful of who you meet in the line of researchers or in any... when you're in a rock group, you can be infiltrated and the concert can be broken up. The art community in town has been broken up by political espionage and agents. The legitimate artists have been pushed aside and the agents have taken over. The music scene, the theater scene, is always infiltrated And I'm not saying, I don't know anything about this group. I don't know them. I haven't met them. We've been on the air a year. Their credentials as researchers are shaky. If you want to, you have to be careful. You can go hear their lectures, ask some questions, and then where Rusty speaks, he was up at Cabrillo, ask questions, and put your heads together, and you figure out what's going on. There were people that heard Rusty Rhodes speak up at Cabrillo that asked him to announce that Dick Sprague would be here the next day on the Monterey Peninsula, and Dick has written many articles for Computer and Automations and has many, many slides of Dealey Plaza in addition to these movies, and they wouldn't announce up in the Santa Cruz area that the people had an opportunity to see these slides and movies down here. The purpose of doing this political research is to say that there was a conspiracy, a coup d'etat in this country, and people who don't want to share that information or facts or turn other people on to sources of information or keep learning themselves, who are literally dragging their feet on the ground. They may not be against us, but they're not with us. And you'll have to use your own judgment. When you mingle among, there's all kinds of people on the outside, and use your own judgment. I'm going to talk about Martha Mitchell because she's the newest political prisoner. There's bumper stickers out now, free the Watergate 5 and free Martha.
Watergate 5 referring to the hotel?
Yes, we'll go into two coincidences. The Republican Party travels really fancy. When Arthur Bremer's paths were retraced, the alleged would-be assassin of Governor George Wallace, he had stayed at the Waldorf Astoria for a couple of days, whining and dining in style, I guess. And that's the New York headquarters of Spiro Agnew. He lives at that hotel when he's in New York. That's a coincidence. But you get to the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., where John and Martha live, and you're getting a little more than a coincidence, because checking into that hotel in Washington, D.C., 2 times in the month of May and also the month of June were 9 guests that checked into the Watergate Hotel that took 2 rooms at the Watergate Hotel. And these guests used pseudonyms, they used aliases that were characters out of books of fiction that a man by the name of Mr. Hunt writes for the CIA. He's written 42 books. He's a novelist, and he writes for the CIA. And they used the names of characters in his books and checked into the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Saturday, the 17th of June, there was a breakthrough in the Democratic headquarters. And 5 of the men who were checked into the Watergate Hotel were caught, and you read about it in the newspapers. You'll be reading about the trial will be going on. They were caught in their fancy dinner suits that they had dined downstairs and had on rubber surgical gloves to leave no fingerprints. And they were taking apart the ceiling of the Democratic National Headquarters, the suites at the Watergate Hotel.
These are 5 of the 9. Were these 5 of the 9 who checked in with the pseudonyms from...
Yes, okay. 5 of the 9, and I'll give you all of the aliases that have been revealed so far. 9 people checked into 2 rooms at the Watergate Hotel, and 5 of them were caught upstairs by the security police of the hotel breaking in the headquarters, and they had very expensive electronic equipment. It seems that they've spent $30,000 in cash so far doing whatever they were doing that night, and they had on them $6,500 worth of cash in crisp new $100 bills, and we'll go into where this came from, in their pocket, and there were 5 of them caught by the police at the Watergate Hotel. That's late Saturday morning, late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. Sunday's paper in Washington, D.C. Didn't mention much about the background of the men they were going into, who they were that had been arrested. Monday, the 19th of June, there was an article that in all the papers all over the country about this break-in at the hotel. On the 24th, that's the next Saturday, that's 1 week later, there's a newspaper article printed around the country, a UPA wire, which was based on a telephone conversation that Martha Mitchell made Thursday following the break-in at the hotel. And she picked up the UPI telephone and said if her husband didn't get out of politics, right away she was going to leave him. That's all the Tennessee Mercury said out here on that day, was if she doesn't get out of politics, I'm going to leave him. Well, the panic that she expressed in just those few words indicated that she knew something about what was happening at the Watergate Hotel. Now, one of the 5 men that was arrested, his name is McCord, and McCord was the chief of all security at Langley, Virginia, for the CIA headquarters for 19 years. He was chief of security on the grounds at Langley, Virginia. And he left the CIA 2 years ago. Left, I say in quotes, because I'm going to show you how this was a total CIA operation and the reasons for this group working together at this particular time. McCord left the CIA, and he was appointed by John Mitchell to be in charge of all security in Miami for President Nixon, for the Republican Party, and he was chief of the committee. He was hired for the security also in Washington for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, and John Mitchell is the chief of that committee. Now, that's an important committee because John Mitchell was the head of the whole Justice Department, and he stepped down to re-elect Richard Nixon. He resigned from the Justice Department for the position to re-elect Richard Nixon. And Mr. McCord left the CIA to be the chief of security for John Mitchell's committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. And McCord was caught in the hotel. Another man that was caught with him, I'll go into the names, his name is Mr. Barker. He was the funding man for the entire Bay of Pigs CIA operation, and that's a lot of money. Into Nicaragua and Guatemala, he carried the cash that paid the Americans and the Cubans. The funding man, he's a very important man in Miami for the funding of the Bay of Pigs operation.
What's your source on that?
Oh, I've brought in all the newspaper articles. There's lots of sources. When we get to Barker, I'll show you the source. So I brought in an outline of about 37 divisions that I've broken this research down into in just the last 8 days. The articles are home except for one Time magazine article, but I have the sources at home. I just brought the outline today because I want to run along and cover so much material. I didn't bring
But that was mentioned.
individual.
Was that
yes.
specifically that he was the funding man for the Bay of Pigs?
He was Barker. One of the men arrested was the funding man for the entire Bay of Pigs operation. Yes, we'll go into the biography of Barker. He was the key role in the Bay of Pigs operation, and he carried with him also from Mexico City. We'll go into the funding later because I don't want to jump around too much. And I want to go back to Martha Mitchell right now so we don't lose that train of thought. That these important men, the man in charge of all the funding for the Bay of Pigs operation, was caught at the Watergate Hotel. And McCord, the former chief of security at the CIA, and the head of the Republican Committee, the security in Miami and in Washington, was caught in the Watergate Hotel, plus 3 other men we'll go into. Well, the police looked for 4 men that are missing, that were registered at the hotel. 5 were caught, and 4 men were missing. Now, Martha Mitchell got on the telephone on Thursday from out in California. They flew her out. She and John Mitchell got on a plane that Saturday night and ended up in California after the robbery had taken place. And she said, I want to get out of politics. She said she didn't like the cop and robber game, and she was adamant that her husband had to get out of politics. She called a UPI wire service, and while she was talking, her telephone was pulled off the wall. And she was in her bedroom at Newport Beach, and she gave a press interview from Maryland when she got back there 2 days later and said, if you could see me, you wouldn't believe me. I'm black and blue. I'm a political prisoner. She said her husband suggested that she should remain in California. They left me in California with absolutely no information, and they don't want me to talk. I'm reading, these are the AP wires, and UPI. She says, I want my husband to get out of this. It's nothing but a robber's game, and I want my husband out of it and leaving right now. Well, Martha Mitchell also said something which was very interesting, and it goes into the question of plausibility and denial that we did on the Pentagon Papers. Martha Mitchell said she was talking on the telephone, and I'm reading the direct quote. This is from the Washington Post Service. They threw me on the bed. 5 men did it, and they stuck a needle in my behind, and I've never been treated like this before. And she showed the reporter 2 bandaged fingers and that a doctor in California stitched up after her battle with 5 guards. And she had bruises on her arms and thighs. Mr. Mitchell went to the White House and talked things over with the president Monday morning, and then he went on to Rye, New York, to speak to his wife. She said Mrs. Mitchell's committee to re-elect the president then put out a statement counteracting what Martha Mitchell said. She said, they threw me on the bed. 5 men did it. There were 5 guards. Now, the committee to re-elect President Nixon counteracted and said, in quotes, she has 1 guard, the same man that goes with her husband and her every place they travel because of threats on their life. Everyone knows Mrs. Mitchell has her personal problems. She's perfectly charming at times, and especially at night. She's not herself. And nobody beat her up. It's just not true. She ever had 5 guards. Now, let's do a little simple arithmetic. 4 men are missing at the Watergate Hotel. 5 are caught, and 2 of them are very important. 9 are registered at the Watergate. 4 are missing. Martha and John Mitchell get on an airplane and go to California. And Martha has 1 guard, usually, but there's 5 with her. Now, there's 4 men in California that don't usually travel with her, and there's 4 men missing from the Watergate Hotel where the Mitchells live. One of the men caught is employed by John Mitchell. He gets $1,200 the month of April, the month of May, so I assume when June was over, he's going to get another $1,200. Martha, I can visualize her. Before I knew that she had this extra entourage with her, I realized that somebody at the Watergate ran into John Mitchell's apartment. They were caught. And that she realized that she would be tied up with this suit. Larry O'Brien of the Democratic Committee has placed $1 million suit against these people for breaking in. Martha plays the game dirty, and so does John when they're not caught. But when they're caught, she panics. See, she doesn't mind all the dirty tricks they did to Bobby Kennedy or John Kennedy or Martin Luther King and hundreds of people along the way. That's not dirty politics. But these guys must have crashed her place, and they took an airplane to California. And I'm doing an article on it now. I want to know how they got to California, and I want Larry O'Brien to tell what plane they took, what pilot. Was it an ITT plane? It wasn't commercial. Martha can count to 5. If 5 people come in my room, it doesn't matter whether she's crazier at night than she is in the daytime. She still can add to 5.
Well, the arithmetic is circumstantial and coincidental, but it is interesting arithmetic.
I think it's interesting arithmetic that the denial also, because last week we read from the Pentagon Papers the plausibility and the denial. If you're caught, you deny knowing anything. And they had to sacrifice Mr. Koenig, who was their between the Vietnamese army and the CIA when they overthrew the junta in Greece. So the point is that they have to say, well, you know, she has her problems, and everyone knows she's got personal problems, that there's only one person assigned. So the arithmetic, living in the apartment and considering these men were employed by, who they were employed by, John Mitchell, is very interesting. Now, John Mitchell claims that he didn't employ these particular men.
Let me get something straight before we get into that now.
Yeah.
The Watergate Hotel is the residence for John and Martha?
Yes, their apartment.
It's also the headquarters for the Democratic National
Well, it's a very
Committee?
there's large hotels, you know, like the Hilton and very large hotels, the Waldorf.
But they're staying in the same hotel.
Yeah, they're in the same hotel.
Committee to re-elect the president's chairman and the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
In the same hotel.
Okay.
Yeah. The chairman lives in that hotel, and the Democratic Party lives in that hotel. And because the man who was caught breaking in the place is directly employed to John Mitchell, and because 4 are missing and 4 show up in California, I think it would be interesting to keep asking what kind of transportation that John Mitchell took. Now, Time magazine came up with an article which was interesting. Sometimes their reporting really bugs me. But they had a question about the suspicion of John Mitchell, and they're calling this now the Washington Bay of Pigs, which is very appropriate. But Time had an article very suspicious of John Mitchell and Patrick Gray, and you can believe there's reason to be. This is July the 3rd issue called Suspicion. And it says that John Mitchell and acting director Patrick Gray both showed up at the Newporter Inn in California, Newport Beach, the day after the arrest. See, John Mitchell's first interview was in the East Coast, and now he's flown out west, he and Martha, and Patrick Gray's there, too. But they're not staying at the same hotel. They don't know each one is out there. See, so Patrick Gray says, well, you know, it's a big place. The Newporter Inn has to be so big that the acting head of the FBI and the former chief of all the justice in California are staying at the hotel and don't know it. So they say that the Mitchell...
Also circumstantial and coincidental, but very interesting.
Yeah, well, even Time says it's suspicious. And they say that Mitchell was in a villa and Patrick Gray was in room 331. And now they're referring to it as Washington's Bay of Pigs. And it's going to be that. And I'm going to try to show in this hour that my interpretation, I've talked for a long time on the reasons that I think it's going to be imperative to kill Richard Nixon before 1972 elections, and there's evidence that the people in power intend to do it. Louis Tackwood has said it from the L.A. Police Department. The intention is to manipulate Richard Nixon into such a position that the next assassin will have a motivation. He won't be the Bremer Oswald type. Now, I cut out 2 articles for the paper this week because the cast of characters, all those 9 people were involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion into Cuba. They were anti-Castro Cubans that live in the Miami area, except for McCord of the CIA, who had direct contacts to the White House as well as Barker. The paper just this week had 2 articles. One was that Nixon's next trip may be to Cuba. Now, this is from New York City. It was a Chicago Tribune article that the State Department is considering the pros and cons of sending Nixon to Cuba. Now, the State Department would only do that, the same State Department that can plan other political assassinations, would only do that to antagonize the anti-Castro Cubans, who are well-trained, well-armed, who would then have a motivation to kill, they would kill Nixon because he is making overtures to Cuba. They said, it goes on, there's an inconsistency in the article that was from the Chicago Tribune by Elliot Janeway, in which it says that politically, the Cuban voters are an important faction in the balance of power in Florida. If the 1972 election is closely contested, Florida is going to be a fierce battleground because the Republicans need this as a turning point as far as the Southern strategy goes. It says Democratic allegiance in 1970 used to belong is going to the Republicans, and Nixon's famous Southern strategy hinges on holding on to these votes, and the Cuban vote is going to play a swing role. In addition, the Cubans have done well in Florida, and they have a large minority voting bloc. Now, if Richard Nixon needs the votes of that large bloc in Florida to win the election, why would he go across the water just a couple hundred miles to antagonize those Cubans and start whining and dining with Castro? Unless the State Department would send him to Cuba, which would then give the motivation for the anti-Castro Cubans to shoot him, and we would have that police state and cancel the elections, which certain people have been manipulating for the last 6 years. Because the very next week after, it says that he may go to Cuba and have two-way traffic for Cubans and Americans and so forth. And they're talking about giving up Guantanamo and Nixon making overtures to Cuba. He wouldn't do that in an election year when he needs the anti-Castro Cuban votes. There's a large mass of those in Texas, California, Louisiana, and Florida, a large mass of people. And Nixon wouldn't go over to Cuba now at the windup before the election and antagonize those votes that he needs. So there's one article that the State Department wants to send Nixon to Cuba. Then there's another article that Brezhnev, this is on the 28th, this last week, reaffirms his aid to Cuba, that the Communist Party chief, Brezhnev, reaffirmed the Soviet defense of Cuban security. He said that Cuba's international position, interest, and security will be supported by Russia. This is inviting a confrontation. You see, somebody is manipulating Richard Nixon. Brezhnev said, when we speak of our fraternal sentiments towards Cuban people, it's not a tribute of politeness or sentimentality. For us, for Soviet communism, friendships will always be associated with businesslike and practical solidarity. And from year to year, Soviet-Cuban relations are becoming richer and fuller. Now, Russia has been out of the picture of Cuba for quite a few months. They have been downplaying their relationship until Castro just went there recently. And Russia has never come out with such a strong statement of a love affair for Cuba. We're going back into Cuba. And it says in the early days, Castro was awarded, or last week he was given the Order of Lenin. And they promised full cooperation and had developed a new friendship at all levels. Now, at the same time that somebody's playing around with Russia, making these overt gestures to Cuba, will always be friendly, will pledge you aid, will pledge you arms and trade. At that time, the State Department both admits that Nixon needs the Cuban votes, the anti-Castro Cuban votes, and that they may send him to Cuba. And I feel that this would be a logical death trap for Richard Nixon. I'm going to go into the biography of these people and the CIA funding of this particular break-in at the Watergate Hotel and show you why. I think it's setting up a death trap for Richard Nixon. A lot of people want to trace this whole thing right up to the White House, but I think it is happening in spite of Nixon. And I think that Martha Mitchell and Richard Nixon would just be two little stumbling blocks in taking over the country and even not having an election.
Okay, Mae, let's deal with that in a minute after we take a very brief break.
Okay.
You're listening to Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell. We'll be back in a moment after we identify the station. Take care of business here. This is 24-hour KLRB FM, Carmel.
Okay, I think we'll just do a quick rundown on those men, those 5 men that were caught.
Okay, these are the men that were caught in the Watergate Hotel headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, right?
Yeah, one was James McCord, Jr., former CIA agent. I'm going to try to show you in the next half hour why it was a whole CIA operation. Of course, they say they're former, but I've said many times that Nixon is a selected agent, and the agency does provide his security. It could also provide his assassination. But I want to talk about James McCord, Jr. It was described as a former CIA agent, a radio specialist with the FBI, and Central Intelligence Security Chief. He had a private security agency in Rockville, Maryland, that John Mitchell hired him from. He left the CIA. His alias at the hotel was Edward Martin. He used the name Edward Martin, and he was the chief of security at Langley, Virginia, of the CIA. The next fellow that was caught in the hotel was this Mr. Barker. He has an alias of Frank Carter. He also is known as Macho. He acted as a CIA money transactor in the planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he transferred from a Mexico City bank $89,000 this last April.
For what purpose?
Well, they said it was for a real estate deal that he had in Miami. He got from undisclosed sources $89,000 in Mexico City, and out of that, $30,000 had been withdrawn and $6,500 were in the pocket, but the sources are not known yet. No one has said what it was for. They said it was for a real estate deal, but when Mr. Barker was arrested, he doesn't give his real estate office. He was using an alias, and he gave his lawyer's number, and the organization that we'll go into is a front organization that doesn't exist.
So this money was recently acquired for this break-in?
Yes, and Mr. Hunt, we'll go into Mr. Hunt from the White House, was down with Mr. Barker in Miami just 2 weeks before the break-in. He was in the direct contact to the White House was down in Miami. But Mr. Barker used an alias of Macho, and the cover story of the New York Times wanted to divert the break-in away from a court of the CIA, so they made it all that the Cubans were involved in this thing, and they said the organization man was Mr. Barker, that he was the top planner of the CIA invasion, and they referred to the New York Times as the top planner of the CIA invasion, and went to Guatemala and Nicaragua and worked on it. He was the most prominent man of the Cuban exile community. He served as the conduit for CIA funds. This was the New York Times article. Phil, you want to know? He was the conduit of CIA funds to the exile community. When he was arrested, he used another alias.
The New York Times said that?
Yes, this is a very big story, this break-in at the Watergate. He was a conduit for CIA funds to the exile community. That was Mr. Barker. Another man that was arrested was Eugene Martinez, who wasn't quite as prominent. He's listed as a real estate agent and a soldier of fortune down in, he was violated for breaking immigration laws in 1958, and he flies airplanes, and he is a licensed real estate agent who works down there for Mr. Barker. Virgilio Gonzalez was arrested at the Watergate. He was a barber in Cuba. He's a locksmith now. It's interesting that they brought a locksmith all the way up to stay at a fancy hotel 2 times. That there are no locksmiths in the Washington area. They brought in a particular team, and the locksmith was brought in. The men that got away, the 4 suspects, no names are given. But that's the list of people that were at the Watergate: McCord and Barker and Gonzalez and Sturgis, Mr. Sturgis, Frank Sturgis. He's known as Frank Fioroni. And he was caught at the hotel. So you have Martinez, Sturgis, Gonzalez, and McCord, and Barker. Those were the 5 people that were caught at the hotel. Now, 2 of those men that were caught had the names of people of a man in their pocket. 2 of the men caught, Mr. Barker had the name of Mr. Hunt in his pocket, Howard H. Hunt, and the phone number. The other man, 2 of the 5 men, had the name of Hunt in their pocket. But none of the newspaper articles from the 8 papers I take every day says who the second man was, because I'm sure it must have been Mr. McCord of the CIA, because he worked with McCord. McCord was in the CIA. Howard Hunt
did.
McCord, who was arrested.
Yeah, Hunt worked with McCord.
Yeah, the biography of Hunt, whose name was in possession of 2 men when they were arrested, was that he was in charge of a CIA operation. He worked for the Bay of Pigs also with the CIA. He was a member of the CIA. He was the CIA's director of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Mr. Hunt was the director of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Mr. Barker was the money man that transacted the money for the Bay of Pigs. All 3 of them were working with the CIA and with the Bay of Pigs. Hunt left town immediately after they found out his name and phone number. They had his name with W.H. and Whitehouse after it. And he left town Monday as soon as the other men were arrested. Then he went right away to New York, and of course the man who hires him, and that's a phony operation too, a cover we'll go into, said he's fired. Right away everyone became fired. McCord was fired and Hunt was fired and so forth. But he left town, Mr. Hunt, and he worked with Mr. Barker, who was arrested. He was with him 2 weeks ago in Miami. Mr. Hunt, who was with the CIA, in charge of the Bay of Pigs operation, was with the transaction, the money man, down in Miami 2 weeks ago. And the money man has lots of money, $89,000, unaccounted for, in continuous $100 bills. So Mr. Hunt's name was listed. Hunt and McCord of the CIA have been friends for a long time. And Hunt worked in the CIA from 1949 until 1970. You see, everyone who's involved here supposedly left their position and is working independently now. But if they were working independently, they would have offices, letterhead, stationery. Mr. Hunt wrote novels for the CIA. He's written 42 books, and he has 3 pseudonyms, too. He goes under the name of Robert Dietrich, John Baxter, and Gordon Davis. And it was the characters from his novels that these 9 men's aliases were registered at the Watergate Hotel. And Hunt was in the White House continuously until March 29th of this year. He had contacts through a Mr. Colson, Howard Hunt. And he's been working into the White House. He was a consultant to the White House, to Charles Colson. And he just recently made a movie about Julie Nixon. He has important connections in the White House, and he has been working directly with Barker, who was arrested. And he works with McCord of the CIA. Charles Colson is a consultant to the White House. He's the man who hired Hunt, or who works with Hunt directly in the White House with Richard Nixon. And Charles Colson has the job consultant to the White House Special Counsel. That's Charles Colson. He and Hunt have been described in Time magazine as the master of the dirty tricks department in Washington, D.C. That Colson does the hatchet job for Nixon and the dirty tricks. Martha Mitchell's talking about dirty tricks. Time magazine says that Colson and Hunt are up in the dirty tricks department of the White House. Dirty tricks has a special connotation in espionage work, and it often involves killings and framing and getting people. It has that special connotation. And Colson has a reputation, and Hunt, of doing the dirty tricks in the Nixon administration in the White House. And Hunt and Barker have been in contact, and Barker is seen with a lot of cash. The sources, you don't know where they come from. And they all work with McCord, who's been with the CIA for the last 19 years in charge of all their security. The Secret Service man who hired Mr. McCord to do the security for Richard Nixon at the Republican convention is Al Wong. I think we mentioned him last week. He's new in the Secret Service. They're being protective about who he is, how long he's worked for Richard Nixon. If Nixon's going to be killed, there's going to be a new team that has moved in since the police state really took over in the last 9 years. It's not going to be the old guard watching Richard Nixon. Just like Lawson of Secret Service was a new man that came in when Kennedy was inaugurated, that was in charge of the Dallas trip. Al Wong is in charge of Secret Service's Technical Security Division, and he hired James McCord, formerly of the CIA, to be in charge of the Republican Security Coordinator. Now, if he hired Mr. McCord has to have an office or a qualification. I should think that the protection of the President of the United States, particularly since we're one bullet away from Spiro Agnew, would be pretty important. So the question, who is going to watch the president in Miami that he doesn't get killed? Because there are already plans disclosed of how he would have been killed in San Diego. So how do you go about hiring a man to represent the security of the President of the United States? Well, the man they hire was in charge of security in Langley, Virginia. His name was James McCord, the man arrested last Saturday. And he had an agency, a private security agency in Maryland. But it's interesting.
Well, that sounds good.
Yeah, that's...
You have a private security agency. That's the kind of firm that you'd want to handle security, right?
That's right. He's been in business 2 years. But he only incorporated his agency after he got the contract from the Republican committee. It wasn't any security agency until he had the contract. So in order to incorporate it, he incorporated November the 10th, 1971, and he got the contract earlier.
One person can't incorporate himself.
No.
He needs other people.
So he needed 3 people. So he put himself on the board of directors, and he put his wife, Mrs. McCord, and then he put his sister-in-law, Mrs. Berry. Well, Mrs. Perry was contacted by the news media. She works out in Houston, Texas for an oil company in Houston, Texas. And she didn't know that she was on the board of directors of this particular agency that's going to protect the President of the United States in Miami. So the Maryland law officials went into there to check this system. And they were listed, this company was listed as nothing about security work at all. They were listed in quotes as a business services studies, analysis, reports in connection with business industry, academic institutions. It was not licensed to perform security services. It paid no income taxes. In 1972, it had no board of directors. This is a CIA organization, front organization, that was set up, in fact, to take control of Mr. Nixon's security, and it does not exist as an actual organization. The funding is an unknown source. We don't even know, I would like to know what oil company that McCord's sister works for. I know the role that John Connally played in the John Kennedy killing. I know the Houston offices of the CIA and the Republican National Bank there in Houston and Miami, the funding of black money for killing. The money that was transferred from Mexico went to the Republican National Bank in Miami. If Nixon has a limit on what they can get for campaign spending, or the Republican Committee for paying security for a man hired like Mr. McCord, the money could come all the way from Texas, from oil money, to his sister. I'm not saying it happened that way, but the organization doesn't exist, and the source of the money, the 89,000 cash that these men have, that are directly related to the White House, is not traced. And when John Mitchell hires, as the head of the committee to re-elect the president, he wants security for the president. He goes to the same organization that killed Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and took a pot shot at Wallace. He is using the same security for President Nixon, the same agency that committed the other assassinations. Now, Mr. McCord's agency is one thing. The other men that were arrested in the hotel had made registration under all these aliases, nom de plume, and they also had a letter stationery called Emeritus, A-M-E-R-I-T-A-S. These 9 anti-Castro Cubans, there were 8 of them in McCord that were at the hotel. Emeritus was an organization. It was supposed to be a secret Cuban revolutionary group, but there's no public records of a corporation of that kind at all. It's a secret organization. They have stationary letterhead. Their purpose, on the outside purpose, was to develop real estate down in Miami. But everyone in the group, the key officers and the directors, are the refugees from Castro's Cuba and were involved in the Bay of Pigs. They used the name of somebody else. They used Hector de la Mera, a Miami accountant, was used on this letterhead of Emeritus. And when these men were arrested, he was surprised when the Associated Press told him that his name was on this list. He says that he was going to be the treasurer of the group, but he decided not to be, and they never told him that he was off the group. They forgot to tell him that his name was used, even though he wasn't on the group. So they're using the name of a man, Hector de Lara, a Miami accountant, for an organization that doesn't exist, that again pays no taxes, that isn't recognized. Now, the federal officials, when they began to investigate who stayed at the Watergate Hotel, because the stationers from the Emeritus, found out the group didn't exist. So this is 2 groups that do not exist in fact, but have funding, and these men are traveling around. There's no record of them in Dade County business transaction of what they do. Now, these are the type of CIA operations that were involved in the killing of Kennedy, but my research into that is very deep, and people sometimes wonder, like on the different shows, why I don't go into some of those details, but an hour goes quickly, we can't. And so I'm taking today's news and showing you what was in your paper this week. If you took the San Jose Mercury or the Monterey Herald, all this information was published if you put it together this way, and in the New York Times. So the conclusion I have is that McCord's agency is a fictitious front. The Emeritus that they checked in at the hotel was fictitious. Now, the man who, Robert Bennett, hired Howard Hunt, whose name was in the phone books of 2 of these men that were arrested, and Robert Bennett is the son of Wallace Bennett, the representative from Utah, the senator, and we talked about him last week. He admitted when the name Hunt came up that he's running a dummy organization to raise money for the re-election of Richard Nixon in Washington. He was caught because he hires and is responsible for Hunt, who was, whose name was in the phone book at the time of the robbery. So then Bennett comes up and says, no, my organization is a dummy organization too. And he admits, he doesn't want to get too investigated, that his organization is a dummy organization. So the firm that hires Mr. Bennett, who sent him into the White House to work with Charles Colson, a 4th group, the Robert Mullen Agency, is a public relations agency, and they admit, that they are a front. They're a public relations agency, and Hunt worked for them. And from there, he goes to the White House, and he works with Charles Colson. And he went right away when they looked for Hunt, and he went to New York, because his name was in the books. He left Washington. He split, went to New York City, said he wouldn't come back and talk with these people. And Ziegler of the White House, in referring to Hunt, said Hunt was in the White House because he's involved with narcotics activities and the flow of drugs into this country. Hunt has to be involved. His contacts with Mr. Barker, McCord, are very heavy. Mr. McCord was hired by the Republicans to guard the convention security. Mr. Barker, who was caught with the cash, is a friend of McCord's. Mr. Hunt was in Miami 2 weeks ago with Mr. Barker, who guards the cash, and Mr. Colson in the White House was the man who works with Hunt and Barker. I'm going slow today, just covering a fraction of this to show how a CIA operation, the chain of command, breaks down. I don't know if it's clear, Phil, as I run along on this thing, how the chain of command breaks down here, and how I try to study who is funding Richard Nixon's campaign, the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. Where does the money come from? Where does the security come? I'm worried about his security in Miami, and these are the men responsible for the security, the anti-Castro Cubans. Now, as far as the funding of this operation, the money has not come through yet. John Mitchell got on the press right away as soon as these men were arrested, and he said, Mr. McCord is the proprietor of a private security agency employed by our committee months ago to assist in the installation of our security system. And he has, as we understand it, a number of business clients and interests that we have no knowledge of. John Mitchell is saying if he bugged the Watergate, he has other clients. They don't have to be mine. They can be other clients. And Mitchell said, we want to emphasize that this man or other people involved were not operating on our behalf or our consent, and I'm surprised and dismayed at these reports. There's no place in our campaign or the electoral process for this activity. Now, if John Mitchell did not hire these men to become involved in some way at the Watergate Hotel, if they were representing other clients, Mr. McCord should have a tax record that he received any money from any other client since he left the CIA 2 years ago. If he has no other clients, and he's not even listed security work, if his only client is John Mitchell, then John Mitchell was responsible for the breaking in, because his paychecks, canceled paychecks, are traced to McCord. If there are other clients, let them speak up. But because there is no institution, there's no organization there for surveillance in Maryland, if there is none, then John Mitchell is directly responsible, I think, for the breaking in at the Watergate. And the motivation, again, if you want to know the motivation of the thing, I think that the State Department will send Richard Nixon between now and election time, or try to Cuba. And that inside Russia, where we have agents, part of the Galen operation, espionage agents, encouraging Russia overtly to make friends with Cuba, just at this time, the motivation for killing Richard Nixon would be the anti-Castro Cubans. You see, he's been in office 4 years, and he hasn't gone into Cuba or done anything about Castro. And a lot of people complain, okay, if you don't want war in Vietnam, if you don't want communists in Vietnam, how about Cuba that's so close to us? Now, the man, William Buckley, I think I mentioned this last week, was one of the men who recommended McCord for his position it was Hunt, to be in the White House. Buckley's name was one of the men, William Buckley, who represented Mr. Hunt of the CIA to be working directly in the White House with Charles Colson. Now, I broke down this whole break into the Watergate into the cover story, which is always the excuse of what was happening. The cover story was that a bunch of anti-Castro Cubans, for some reason, were afraid that McGovern may be soft on Cubans, or they wanted to see what policy the Democrats would have towards Cuba. That has to be a cover story. They would never spend these thousands of dollars and go to all this trouble, because they already know that whatever McGovern does to Cuba is softened in comparison to what Richard Nixon would do, and Nixon didn't serve their interests at all. So this group, I believe, would be strongly anti-Nixon and would have every reason to kill him. On behalf of the CIA, they're working closely with the CIA in order to stop the elections in 1972. Larry O'Brien, the old body snatcher, I call him the old body snatcher, made his quotation that it was the ugliest question of the integrity of the political process in a quarter of a century. It was Larry O'Brien at Parkland Hospital with Kenny O'Donnell who literally grabbed John Kennedy's body off the table into a coffin and weaved their way in and out of the Dallas officials. The coroner there and a judge tried to stop them from removing that body. They said, we want this to be considered a regular homicide, just like any other homicide. And if John Kennedy's autopsy had been conducted at Parkland Hospital, it might have been that they'd find more holes in him than the one that Bethesda, Maryland found. They found the one in his back and one in his head, the fatal wound. John Kennedy had more holes in his body. The viewing of his coat would prove it. The autopsy x-rays would prove it. The car's been destroyed, but there's evidence locked up for 75 years that would prove what I'm saying. And it was essential to get him to Parkland Hospital where the original autopsies were burned. And the FBI report has another bullet going finger length into his body that would make more bullets than Oswald could get out in that given time period. Therefore, he would have accomplices. Even if Oswald shot a weapon, which he did, it would prove he had accomplices, which equals conspiracy. And Lyndon Johnson gave the orders to Larry O'Brien and Kenny O'Donnell to get that body forthwith to Bethesda, Maryland. And that's where all the information was locked up and tied up. And if Larry O'Brien had just opened his eyes, he said this was supposed to be the administration of law and order. I don't know where Larry O'Brien was 2 weeks ago when Pershing Gervais surfaced and said that for John Mitchell, he lied and framed evidence against Jim Garrison. I don't know where Larry O'Brien's been the last 10 years that he called, or the last 4 years, he calls this the law and order administration. They've broken every law and brought more disorder to this country than anybody could do. This team, even in Time magazine, conservative Time magazine, questions Dole, and it questions the honesty of the people, Mitchell and the team in Washington, to really tell the truth about what's happening. They question, and call it suspicion. Now, Jack Anderson had an article this week on secrets, which goes back to the autopsy papers and keeping secrets against the people, because the Watergate is just a preview of what's going to happen. General Abrams has brought the war home. 10,000 men are coming home this week. Martha Mitchell got a needle in her behind. Nixon's going to go. And a lot of it originated with the secrets. This overthrow of the government was allowed to take place because people let these secrets pass by without speaking up. Jack Anderson was talking about the Pentagon Papers today and wanting to get access to the secrets, and he said, I will continue to publish and expose all that's happening. And I'm going to read his quotation and ask why he doesn't project himself into the Kennedy problem or the political assassination as much as Vietnam. He says, the power to classify information must be recognized for what it is. It is nothing less than the absolute authority of the government to make a state secret of whatever it wishes. And this divine right to classify documents has been abused to a degree beyond toleration. Not only does the government sweep its bungles and blunders and errors, embarrassments under the secrecy label, but our entire foreign policy and defense posture remains secret, except for the federal government thinks it is in its own interest to make public. He said the tragic, bitter lesson of Vietnam has shown the fatal consequence of allowing any president to exercise power in splendid isolation behind the double wall of executive privilege and official secrecy. Now, he's saying since Vietnam, the escalation of Vietnam and the government secrets really became tight after John Kennedy was killed. As soon as the Warren Commission began their work, the Chief Justice of the entire Supreme Court, Earl Warren, said many of the pieces of facts or information into the killing of John Kennedy will be locked up for the lifetime of anyone existing now. 75 years is the date set. To get access to the coat of John Kennedy, the x-rays of his autopsy, he was denied a real autopsy as if it were a homicide in Dallas. And all of a sudden, the old body snatch, Larry O'Brien, is indignant. Now, I do feel that one of the things that could happen in addition to killing Richard Nixon in Miami, because they have the blueprints of all the Democratic offices and the air conditioning, and that came out in the paper this week too, is to plant people in the office who will talk about the killing of Richard Nixon and then blame it on the Democrats. I think the importance of the anti-Castro Cubans getting into the Democratic office in Miami and Washington is that Patrick Gray and John Mitchell collect talking conversation about how Nixon was going to be killed and pin the rap on people who were planted in that office, because among these 5 men that were caught, 2 of them were registered Democrats. And I feel that there's a very hard power struggle going on. Greece was overthrown by the United States Army, the Central Intelligence Agency. A populist man, Andreas Popper, was about to really put a hard contest on for the existing military authorities, for the ruling class, and for the new military colonels that were in power. The elections were canceled in April, and they were supposed to take place in May. And the United States was responsible for that coup. And the abortive Bay of Pigs group did not break up after the Bay of Pigs. They were in Washington. The planning man, the funding man, they're messing around with the Democratic Party. They're planning to send Nixon to Cuba. Russia's making friendship with Cuba. The whole thing stinks. And Martha Mitchell will be locked up. She is a political prisoner because she saw those 4 men. And I'll bet you those 4 men were the ones that are missing. They left California. They've gone to Mexico. Maybe they're down in Guatemala now, their old headquarters. We don't know who they are or how important they were, because we know that 2 of those men caught were very important. And the 4 that remained behind. Maybe in Mitchell's apartment getting the communications, seeing if the bugging was working. We don't know where they were. There were 9 registered. 4 were missing. And it all adds up to my conspiracy theory of the last year, Phil, of what I've been trying to say, that 1972, the next 2 or 3 months, is going to see a drastic change, I feel, in this country. And that the whole Watergate incident is one of the most important pieces that proves that the CIA, the people that hate Nixon, are working in Miami just like a team would have worked in San Diego. You know, the TAC would talk to